So it's a great honor and pleasure to introduce our afternoon keynote speaker, Matthew Botvinick from Google DeepMind. He's Director of Neuroscience Research at DeepMind and Honorary Professor at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit at University College London. He completed his undergraduate studies at Stanford University in 1989 and medical studies at Cornell University in 1994, before completing a PhD in psychology and cognitive neuroscience at Carnegie Mellon University in 2001. He served as assistant professor of psychiatry and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania until 2007 and professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton University until joining DeepMind in 2016. His work at DeepMind reaches from cognitive psychology to computational and experimental neuroscience and artificial intelligence. It covers reinforcement learning, spatial temporal reasoning, and cognitive modeling, among others. He's also an ELLIS Fellow in the program on natural intelligence. So we are very much looking forward on his presentation on the computational turn in deep learning.
Great, thank you very much. Just to confirm, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, okay, well, it's a great pleasure to join you. Yeah, I'm a proud participant in the larger ELLIS effort, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to connect with people on this side of the program. I really appreciate the invitation. What I want to talk about is this thing that I'm going to call the compositional turn in deep learning. And I want to start, I'll talk about some particular pieces of research, but really at the high level, I want to start with some observations on the deep learning revolution. So a lot of the people I work with at DeepMind are quite young, brilliant and quite advanced in their research, but young. And I think a lot of them have the impression that deep learning research began around 2012 with this, of course, epoch-making breakthrough on ImageNet. And it is undeniable that that was an epochal event in the history of artificial intelligence. And what's followed since then has really been, pretty mind-blowing, from image classifications to image generation, for example, in this very cool work from OpenAI called DALL-E. Of course, reinforcement learning, leveraging deep learning, most famously perhaps in AlphaGo or AlphaStar, and then other applications like protein folding. It really is only fair to call what's happening these days a revolution. And a lot of our collective attention has been focused over the last year or two on the emergence of these quite remarkable large language models. For example, GPT-3. Many of you will recognize this screenshot of a very amazing sample from that model. But again, I think a lot of people have the impression that all of this began around 2012, and I find it sort of I find it interesting, and for some of my younger colleagues, I think it's enlightening to look back at the neural network research literature before that. And when you do that, it becomes clear that a lot of the things that are going on right now in the deep learning revolution really have their roots in work that was going on 30 years ago. And I don't just mean, you can connect the dots from here to there. I mean, things that are almost exactly the same were already happening 30 years ago. So, for example, of course, I mentioned Krzyzewski et al.'s work on ImageNet using convolutional neural networks. But of course, convolutional neural networks were invented back in the 1990s by some of the same people, actually, and were already being trained with backprop. DeepRL, of course, has been there have been real methodological breakthroughs that have allowed applications that we never could have dreamed of even a few years ago. But the idea of using backprop nets as a basis for function approximation in RL is also something that goes back more than approximately 30 years, and you just have to look at Tesaro's groundbreaking work on backgammon to see a direct precursor for what's happening today. And the same actually is true for language models. So I'm sort of like honestly shocked at how few people are aware of this among the people I work with. But Jeff Ellman built next word prediction models back 30 years ago that were virtually identical in spirit to the models that we're all talking about now, and did really amazing latent space analyses. These were recurrent neural networks, and looking at the kind of phase space of these networks in a principal components analysis. So this is a visualization of the trajectory of the latent state of the network for the sentence "boy who chases boy chases boy." So these are all like very direct reflections of what's going on today. And of course, what's happened in the interim is we have much bigger computers, right? And we have much better data sets to exploit. But I think it is fair to say that a lot of people who were working on these issues 30 years ago might have seen this coming, might have, nothing that's going on this front now is qualitatively different from what those people were after back then. But the point I want to make actually is in some ways the opposite of that, because in my view, as someone who's like been around to follow these developments in neural network research, there is something really new that's happened over the last few years, and I find it really exciting. And it has to do with compositionality. So if you look at the kind of theoretical focus of discussions in neural network research, even in like 2010, as represented by this pair of papers that came out in Trends in Cognitive Sciences that year, you can see that the proponents of neural network modeling and people who were skeptical of it at that point in history were both focused on a particular issue, which is compositionality. It's structure learning. It's representing data in a way that acknowledges that it's composed of stable building blocks that recur across different samples. And the argument was basically from the neural network believers, the connectionists, that very little was needed to get compositionality. You just needed to take emergence seriously. And then from skeptics of deep learning, or what came to be called deep learning, the opposite argument that in fact different methods were necessary in order to get compositional structure to emerge. And this argument has continued very much up until near the present day. So there's very influential work by Brendan Lake and colleagues that many of you will know, suggesting that neural networks are inherently challenged when it comes to representing compositional structures. And the one example that they gave is, imagine this thing, which is sort of a composition of things you are familiar with, a Segway, a motorcycle, and a unicycle. And it makes it easy to kind of think of this novel thing as composed of ingredients from those three sources. And many of you will know this group's work with the Omniglot data set, which made a similar argument in much more restricted setting. And the argument is that in order to get systems that really understand how data is made up of a composition of parts, you really have to go beyond deep learning. You have to engage in symbolic modeling. You have to at least consider neurosymbolic systems that build generative models that are highly structured in ways that traditional neural networks are not. And people who have advocated for deep learning over the years have stuck to the argument that that shift in implementational approach is not really necessary. But if you look at the research that those people were doing, you can see they were struggling with compositionality. That's evident in Ellman's work. I mean, Ellman's work was in some ways a direct effort to deal with the compositional structure of language by using temporal invariance as it arises in recurrent neural networks. There's work that at least used to be famous by Jeff Hinton, something called the family trees model, in which he proposed using slots that were linked to different thematic roles, agent, patient, relation, and so forth, in order to capture tree structures. And there's work in recurrent neural networks with attractor dynamics, for example, proposing how you can get compositional functionality in the domain of spelling to sound. But these were all sort of, suggestions on how progress could be made toward compositionality. But in a way, they're very framing acknowledged implicitly that compositionality was a challenge for deep learning. And you can see this also in work on in computational neuroscience, which was wrestling to get neural networks, artificial neural networks, to do very much the same thing. This is work by Randy O'Reilly and colleagues proposing how the prefrontal cortex might encode things like thematic roles, like again, agent, patient. Bob ate the steak. You have to have some structural representation to know that it wasn't that the steak ate Bob. So, I said a couple moments ago that in my humble opinion, there is something new going on that was not anticipated 30 years ago, and that I'm really excited about, and it is the emergence of architectures in deep learning that that really confront this problem of compositional representation. And the best two representatives of this are graph nets and the architecture I'll focus on mainly in what follows, namely transformer models, which of course have been at the center of the revolution in natural language processing and are now finding application much more widely. So the point I'm making here about the importance of these kind of architectural innovations and the help that they give us in capturing compositional structure is I'm essentially just echoing points that were made in a couple papers that I'm showing on the screen here, and I highly recommend one that I was involved with that was led by Pete Battaglia, and then another fascinating paper led by Klaus Greff. So if you're interested in kind of getting broader background in the point I'm making at a high level here, I recommend these papers. So what do I mean by compositionality? Well, as far as I know, there's no satisfying formal definition of what compositionality really means. I mean, there are things that are called compositionality, like function composition, but it doesn't really capture the richness of the concept. But there are certain sort of features that are important here. One is just discreteness. So to represent data as built up of stable building blocks, you need those discrete building blocks to start with. That's obviously the case in language, where we have words as the building blocks. But as I'll mention in a minute, there are other ways in which we can think about these building blocks taking shape in other domains. Another aspect of compositionality is the type token distinction. So you need to be able to represent multiple instances of a particular category in a compositional structure. In language, again, this is obvious. The boy who chases the boy, you need to be able to keep track of the fact that there are two instances of the token of the type boy here. Another side of compositionality is the fact that there are stable building blocks, but that they inflect one another without losing their individual identity. So you have individual words in language, but the way that you concatenate these words in a sentence inflects the role that they play in the emerging meaning. And one way of capturing that inflection is through the concept of thematic role assignment. So here, this word boy becomes the subject of the sentence, or the agent in the situation described. And for obvious reasons, architectures like transformers give us a leg up on this. We have a bunch of input slots, which immediately put us in a situation where we have discrete entities. They allow us to deal with the type token distinction because, of course, you can have the same vector in x1 and x2 here. We have stable building blocks in the sense that words are embedded in a consistent way, but then they talk to one another through self-attention, and they can inflect one another in a way that allows encoding, for example, of thematic role assignment. I find this all encouraging from a neuroscience point of view as well. I mean, the main point of my talk here is not to dwell on neuroscience, but I'll throw in a couple points as I go along. there are some aspects of large-scale brain structure that I think make it plausible that what we're dealing with in transformers is at least broadly related to some things that happen in the brain. And so, for example, if you look at an elaboration on transformers called a universal transformer proposed by Degani and colleagues, what they do is they turn the transformer stack into a recurrent neural network. They just repeat the connection weights from one layer of the transformer stack to the next. And if you take that step, which is not unique anymore to this work, then you end up with two kind of motifs. You have the self-attention motif, which is sort of like lateral connectivity, where vector representations talk to one another through lateral connections. And that, of course, is a very well-known aspect of large-scale brain structure. Different patches of cortex talk to one another through extensive lateral connections. But you also have this recurrent connectivity, which essentially establishes closed loops from each portion of the input back to that portion of the input. And this is something that we also see in the brain through loops that go through the basal ganglia and the thalamus. So I find it intriguing that we have these broad architectural parallels. I think it's something that'll have to be investigated over the coming years to see whether that analogy really holds up, but it's something I'm kind of excited about. Moving on from neuroscience, though, so what I've shared as my view so far, that the emergence of these architectures, things like graph nets and transformers, put us in a new spot historically in deep learning, because they give us a way of coping with compositional structure. But what I'm really excited about now as we move forward is taking the next step from systems that compose elements that are sort of given in the data, things like words, to systems that also decompose the data, systems that retain this ability to put together relational structures, but which also learn how to carve the input data into chunks, that discover these entities, these discrete entities, as part of the learning process. And one example that I'll focus on going forward is objects, physical objects. It's sort of obvious on the face of it that the world is made up of discrete objects, and that we can understand the world through the properties of these objects and their interactions, at least to a large extent. This is something we know from cognitive science. Decades of research have shown that the brain is very, very much attuned to whole objects as a target of attention and tracking. So just to give you a couple of examples of the evidence that exists, there's this very famous study by Egli, Driver, and Rafal, where they showed two bars on a display, and then they would briefly cue one end of one of these bars. So it would just sort of flash. And then a moment later, one end of one of these bars would have like a little square placed in it. And that square would either be placed in this location marked with a V, or in this location over here marked ID, or this location marked IS. And so if the target, so the subject's job was to indicate which of the bars, or which side the target was on. And if the target occurred right where the initial cue had occurred, the subject was very fast because their attention had been sort of involuntarily drawn to that spot. But what was interesting was that there was a reaction time difference between these two locations, even though they were both the same physical distance from the initially cued spot. And the take-home result was that subjects were much faster to respond to the final target if it occurred on the same bar as the initial cue. So even though the subject was perfectly free to ignore this initial cue, it didn't really carry any information about where the final target would be. They nonetheless were faster if the ultimate target occurred on the same physical object as the initial cue, suggesting that the visual system is set up to select whole objects rather than local spatial locations. And we see a similar insight from studies of patients with brain damage. This is an indication of where the parietal lobe is in the human brain. And patients with bilateral damage to the parietal lobe sometimes develop something called Balint syndrome. And Balint syndrome is a fascinating disorder where people are essentially only able to attend to one object at a time, and are unable to make judgments that involve them to integrate information across multiple objects. So, for example, a patient with Bayesian syndrome would be able to tell you whether or not this is a trapezoid or a rectangle, but they would have a great deal of difficulty telling you whether these two bars presented simultaneously, whether the one on the right is taller or the one on the left. This, of course, requires reasoning across two objects. This is about one object, and another indication that the brain is really set up to select whole objects as a unit of analysis. Just as another example, a patient with Bayesian syndrome could tell you that this is a star, but they would have a harder time telling you that this is a star. They would only see triangles in that situation because of the difference in coloring. So these observations have led cognitive scientists for many years to portray visual scene understanding as first parsing into discrete objects or entities, and then a sort of graph-like integration of those entities. And we're now, because of these innovations in deep learning architectures and methods, I think getting to a point where we can kind of bottle that sort of functionality in the artificial systems that we're building. And the first tool that we now have at our disposal is, of course, systems that parse visual data into objects. Here I'm a little bit worried that I might repeat some of the material that was covered earlier today by Thomas Kipf, because his contributions in this area have been really quite impactful. For example, his slot attention work. But here on the screen, I'm mentioning some work from our own group, which tackles this problem of unsupervised object identification or instance segmentation, a system pioneered by Chris Burgess called Monet. And the basic idea here is just that the system is ultimately tasked with going from an image to a reconstruction of that image, but using there's a compositional bottleneck that requires the system to produce a series of masks and then to compose the reconstruction one mask at a time. Within the pipeline is a VAE that rewards the system essentially for using as few bits as possible. And that puts pressure on the system ultimately that drives it to discover discrete objects in the data. So this is, on the right here is our images from the Clever data set. Down in the third row, you can see the segmentation that Monet finds. And then down in the further rows, you can see reconstructions that only use one of the latent representations corresponding to one of these objects. And it does cool things like it de-occludes objects. So you can see this blue ball is occluded, but when you reconstruct only that object from this kind of decomposition that Monet has found, it de-occludes it and does fascinating things like this. Now there are a bunch, as many of you will know, there are a bunch of systems that do this kind of thing. This is a great tool to have available. Our group at DMind has extended this kind of work recently in what I find to be a fascinating way, applying it to videos. And here, the focus is on object-level decomposition, but also another kind of decomposition, which is decomposing a stable allocentric representation of a scene from a representation of the egocentric point of view. The way that this is accomplished is by decomposing an initial video into a set of object latents. So this so far is very much like what you get from slot attention or Monet, but also accompanying that a set of frame latents that represent in vector form some information about what's going on in a particular frame of the video. So in more detail, there's an encoder that starts by taking each frame in a video, putting it through a convnet, taking the resulting feature stack, flattening it, putting it through a pair of transformers, unflattening it, and then taking the mean of the resulting feature stack in two different ways. So there's a temporal mean, which leads to a set of object latents, and a spatial mean, which leads to frame latents. And then there's a decoder, which frame by frame takes the object latents and one of the frame latents and uses that through a deep network to output a set of attention weights, spatial attention weights, and then visual features to fill in the resulting mask in the form of a Gaussian mixture. And so there's nothing in this architecture, of course, that explicitly requires the system to decompose things into objects, or to decompose things into an allocentric representation of the environment and time-specific viewpoints. But the compositionality that's built into the architecture itself and the averages that are used in this step of the encoder lead to that outcome. So, by the way, this system has been nicknamed Simone, and the lead on this project is a fellow named Rashad Kabra. And you can see here some results where you have an input video, and you can see that Simone is segmenting the video in a stable way so that individual objects maintain their kind of slot affiliation over time, meaning that objects are being meaningfully tracked. But perhaps even cooler, if you go to individual units in the latent representation on the for the object latents, or alternatively the frame latents, you get very different results. So in these 3 frames on the right, you're looking at what happens in the reconstruction if one of the units in a single object latent vector is kind of intervened on, so that the mean that it represents is manually changed. And you can see that the position or identity of a single object is transformed depending on which latent unit you choose. If, on the other hand, you choose a latent unit in the frame latent, what you end up manipulating is the viewpoint on an otherwise stable scene. And here's another example of that, but based on the Cater data set. This is a busy image, but what's going on here is that you have a bunch of different images from Cater, and then so you start with a single image from Cater, and then you twiddle a single latent unit, either again in the domain of objects or in the domain of the frame latents. And so if you look along a row, you see what happens to the initial image if you twiddle a particular object latent. So in the top row, there's just one object, this green cone, that's moving when you twiddle that latent. So obviously, there's one object latent that is representing the position of that green cone, and twiddling one of the units in that latent vector is controlling the position of that cone in a very kind of smooth trajectory. And the same, you can see something analogous happening in each of the remaining rows. You see a single object, at least in most of the rows, moving when you twiddle that latent unit. But if instead you take the same initial image, but you twiddle a unit that lives in the frame latents, then what happens is you get a consistent transformation of the initial image in terms of viewpoint. So now if you attend to the first column, of course, we're looking at different scenes, we're looking at different sets of objects. But if you kind of scroll your eyes along that first column, you'll see that the view is panning to the right, is kind of rotating around to the right. And if you look at the third column, you can see that twiddling a different latent unit pans in the opposite direction, regardless of what's in the scene. And then there's another unit that pans out, so this fourth column. So even though it wasn't required, so to speak, of the latent representations in this architecture, the system has not only decomposed these scenes into objects, but also into an allocentric, like time-independent, viewpoint-independent format paired with a discovered representation that stands independent of the time-varying viewpoint. So that's just an example, again, of how, very pleasingly, we're starting to get a handle on how to use these architectures that encourage compositional representational structure to give us something that cognitive scientists have been telling us for a long time we need to really capture human-like understanding of the visual world. And rather than just using these architectures to compose entities that are given, here we have a more end-to-end, an opportunity to do something more end-to-end, where the entities themselves are being discovered by capitalizing on these compositional architectures. But so far I haven't really given you an example of why this would pay off. I've given you examples of how it can be done, but the cognitive scientists tell us that really understanding the world relies on decomposing it and then recomposing it in this way. And so what I want to describe now is a couple of research projects that that provides some evidence that doing this really does pay off for scene understanding, and in particular, understanding video. So let's start with this data set called Cleverer, which is, many of you will know this. It's based on the Clever data set, but it takes it into the video domain and sets up some very challenging question answering problems. So the Cleverer data set includes not only descriptive questions like what shape is the object that collides with the cyan cylinder, but also explanatory questions like which of the following is responsible for the gray cylinders colliding with the cube. Even harder, there are predictive questions like which event will happen next, and most challenging, counterfactual questions like without the gray object, which event will not happen. So the people who proposed this very fascinating data set suggested in the same paper that deep learning systems were really going to have a hard time capturing the causal structure that's that you have to understand in order to answer these questions, especially the predictive and counterfactual ones, and that it might be necessary in order to deal with data sets of this kind to resort to neurosymbolic methods. So we wanted to see how far we could get with the kinds of really simpler approaches that are available and that I've been talking about so far. So in work that was led by David Ding, we built a system that we nicknamed Aloe, and the idea is just really simple. We take a completely standard transformer network based on BERT, and we feed in the words that are involved in the question in the data set, and also in multiple choice questions, also the words that are involved in the answer. But instead of just embedding the words, we also embed a set of objects extracted from the videos. And here we could have used any number of different methods like slot attention or iodine, but we used Monet. So Monet was used in order to pull out individual object embeddings from each frame of the video, and then those were the elements, kind of like words that were fed into the transformer right alongside the words. So it's not like a bipartite system. We just fed in both objects and words into the same exact transformer. So David also used self-supervised learning in order to enrich the internal representations of those objects. So for example, during pre-training, he would hold out a single object per frame and ask the transformer to fill that in, or to predict where an individual object was going to be, or to infill an object based on before and after data, and several other self-supervised tasks. And what we end up with is a conceptually very simple approach compared to some of the neurosymbolic methods that had been earlier proposed, but one which outperforms those methods. So not only does this Aloe architecture do much better at answering the questions in the data set, including the predictive and counterfactual questions, than the neurosymbolic methods that had been earlier proposed, but if you ablate our architecture in a way that removes the object level representations, for example, using a ResNet and the resulting feature matrix as inputs to the transformer, you lose that performance. You take a real hit in terms of accuracy. So at least in this implementation, it looks like having those object level representations available to cross-attend with the words in these very difficult inference questions is a big win. And you can see what's going on in the architecture, and it makes a lot of sense if you look at where the self-attention is operating. So if you look at, so to speak, where these objects that are highlighted are attending on the word side, you see that the blue cylinder is attending to words that are relevant to the blue cylinder, and the yellow cube is attending to words that are relevant to the yellow cube. So the pattern of attention makes really perfect sense. And the pattern of attention is also interestingly dynamic. So when the system is evaluating whether this first answer should be judged correct. The brown object collides with the green object. You can see over frames that first it attends to the brown object and to the green, the blue cylinder, which is supposed to be removed in one's imagination in this counterfactual question. And then later it starts attending to the green object, which of course the candidate answer names. So you can see that that exposing objects and putting them alongside words is something that that self-attention is really exploiting in a way that's very transparently sensible. David went on to apply Aloe to a couple of other data sets with comparable results. So I'll just briefly mention what he found here. I mentioned Acre a minute ago. Many of you will know Acre. It's another visual reasoning from video data set. And here, the couple of catches are that there's a moving camera and that the main task is to keep track of the location of this golden ball. They call it the snitch from Harry Potter. And you can see that it's a little bit like a shell game because the snitch goes underneath other objects and gets moved around. So you have to track it even when it's hidden. Again, a case where it had been proposed that neurosymbolic methods might be needed in order to get to the right answers. But our system produces state-of-the-art results compared, at least in most evaluation approaches, with not only methods that try to get by without objects, but also neurosymbolic methods that have been applied to this same data set. And then one more data set that we looked at in this project is a very recently proposed data set called Acre, which builds on a very influential experimental paradigm from developmental psychology, which is about causal learning. Alison Gopnik, a very influential developmental psychologist, had done a series of experiments in which children were asked to try to figure out whether an individual object is or is not a blicket. So that's a novel word. And a blicket is defined just as an object that if you put it on top of a box, it makes the box activate. So in the experiments, the box would start making music, and in the Acre data set, this box lights up. So you can see here, probably this blue cube is not a blicket, but this gray cube is a blicket because it makes the box light up. And so simple questions would be, at the end of seeing this series of images, a simple question would be, is this blue cube a blicket, or is this gray cube a blicket? But there are more interesting questions you can ask. For example, is this purple cube a blicket? And the only time that this purple cube was presented, or it was always presented with other objects. So how would you know whether this purple cube is a blicket or not? And the answer is, you can tell that it's a blicket because this same purple cylinder appeared over here and the box didn't light up. So you know that the purple cylinder isn't the blicket, which means that it must be the purple cube that's activating the box. So you can see that there's sort of multi-step inference that you have to engage in order to answer some of the harder inference questions. And it had been shown in these developmental psychology experiments that children are actually quite good at this. And so the question is, can we get deep learning systems to show the same form of intelligence? And once again, the original presenters of this data set suggested that maybe we need something beyond traditional deep learning in order to get there. But David was able to show, using our architecture, that in fact, if you just parse these images into objects using Monet and then let them cross-attend, then you get very high quality results from that, suggesting that these compositional methods are really quite powerful. So let me tell you quickly about another project that again riffed off some methods from developmental psychology. There's a whole line of very famous developmental psychology experiments looking at intuitive physics, people's sort of intuitive understanding of how physics works in the real world, that was based on showing children essentially magic tricks. So this is a video experiment that was done very famously by René Bayesian and colleagues. And the idea is to set up a situation that is a magic trick in the sense that it makes something appear to happen that, if it were really happening, would violate the laws of physics. And you can tell that children understand those intuitive laws of physics because they're surprised by the magic trick. The magic trick is, you know, an unexpected thing for them. And you can tell they're surprised because they stare longer at the magic trick than they do at an otherwise comparable event that sort of obeys the laws of physics. So one way of establishing whether deep learning systems possess the same kind of intuitive understanding of physical events is to replicate these developmental psychology experiments and to show neural networks some magic tricks and see whether they're surprised. And so following this logic, my colleague Luis Plato did exactly that. So a paper that's under review now, he procedurally generated a large number of probe videos that that included pairs of videos that either did or did not violate some basic law of intuitive physics. So here you see a ball kind of nicely bouncing off a cube, obeying something that developmental psychologists have called directional inertia. But on the right, you see a magic trick. The ball is bouncing off the cube, but not in the kind of reflective way that physics would require. And this is something that had been used in developmental psychology experiments to demonstrate that young children understand that this is okay and this is not. Another example is something that the psychologists call continuity. So you can see in the examples on the left here that a ball going behind these two pillars is very obediently showing up when it goes between the two pillars. But on the right, you have a magic trick where it somehow magically fails to appear when it passes between the two pillars. And again, in psychology experiments, it had been shown that children were surprised by this. Another example is something called object persistence. So on the left, you can see a plank falling on an object, and the object can be seen to keep that plank from falling all the way to the ground. And on the right, you see the magic trick where the plank is nonetheless falling flush to the ground, which it really shouldn't do, given the normal laws of physics. Another example is solidity, where objects are falling into this container, but either they're falling much further, in the magic trick, either they're falling way further into the container than they should, or they're stopping too soon. Again, kind of violating what you should understand about the collision between this object and the bottom of the container. And again, something that young children understand. Finally, something called unchangeableness, where objects should retain their shape, position, and color. And on the left, you see a legal sequence of events. And on the right, you see this kind of occluder coming down. And then when the occluder goes up, something's changed about the objects that were occluded. So these were Lewis's translating what the kind of magic tricks that had been employed in developmental psychology experiments into videos. And then there's a huge corpus of these that we could use in a machine learning experiment. And then the architecture that he built to look at this is something that we nicknamed Plato. And basically the idea is similar to what I've been talking about so far. You take a frame from a video, you use Monet to decompose it into discrete objects. You use slots to organize the embeddings of each of those objects. And then you feed each frame representation into a graph network along with all representations of the previous frames. And that lies in continuity with a recurrent neural network. And at each time step, the network's job in a kind of self-supervised training regime is just to predict the object level representations that will describe the next frame of the system. So importantly, Lewis did not use those probe videos that I just described in the training set. The training set instead was a procedurally generated set of videos that were more freeform. So you can see a set of examples on the left. And there's just all sorts of random stuff going on here, right? It's not, none of this corresponds exactly to the events that were eventually probed in those very carefully constructed magic trick videos. But of course, all of the kind of component events are there for the system to learn about if it has the right kind of learning mechanism. And so, but then at test, the point was to look at how the system reacted either to the physically permissible videos on the one hand, or the magic trick videos on the other, which were otherwise matched very carefully on every other factor that was controllable, and to see how surprised the network was, to see how off its predictions were about what should happen in these probe videos. And what we found was that, in fact, across these 5 conceptual categories, this architecture was indeed surprised by the magic trick more than anything that happened in the kind of physically legal videos. And that was true either at the level of average accuracy, like classifying whether a video was legal or illegal, and also in a more quantitative way at the level of a measure of surprise. But perhaps more importantly, we also found that in a ablation that removed object level representations and relied instead on features coming out of a convolutional neural network, we essentially lost this effect. So again, having those object level representations going into an architecture that emphasizes compositional computation, here a GraphNet, that's really what allowed the system to generalize from these free-form videos to these very targeted conceptual probes. And one cool side note about this result is it actually didn't take much data to get the system to this level. In fact, the entire training data set amounts to about 7 days of continuous waking visual learning. And in fact, asymptotic results were obtained with just a day and a half of data. So this is not a particularly difficult result to get in terms of the quantity of visual data required, which maybe is something of interest from the developmental psychology point of view as well. Okay, so I have a little bit more to tell you about, but I'll try to wrap it up in the next, say, five, certainly less than 10 minutes. So I've been talking about objects and using object level representations with these compositional architectures in order to get a better understanding of the dynamic physical world. But of course, there's more to understanding objects and the way that they behave than just understanding collisions and occlusions. Objects have all sorts of other interesting properties. So, if you know anything about microwaves, you can predict what's going to happen on the left, and that it's something an outcome that you might want to bring about if you're, say, baking. You might want to melt this butter, but you know that the situation on the right is very different, and you probably don't want to press start on this microwave because bad things are going to happen. And knowing that is really much more than understanding the kind of mechanical properties of objects. You have to understand their latent properties and the way that they interact. And of course, that can have very serious behavioral implications. And so we wanted to kind of push toward tasks that require deep learning systems to get under the hood and understand something about the latent causal structure of physical objects and their interactions. And in order to probe this, we developed a new reinforcement learning environment that we call Alchemy. And this is work that was led by Jane Wang. So Alchemy is, again, it kind of takes us into a magical Harry Potter world, but it's basically a chemistry set. So the idea is that there's an agent that can pick up objects and then can dunk them in different potions. And the potions sometimes have no effect, but sometimes they transform these objects or stones into different visual forms. And this mechanism is embedded into a video game where the goal is to gain as many points as possible, and each stone is worth a certain number of points. The stones that have brighter little indicators, like this bright white indicator here, are more valuable. And so what the agent needs to do is take stones, pick them up, transform them into more valuable forms, and then plop them into this central cauldron, which is where the point value of each stone is collected. But there's a catch. So the game is organized into trials, meaning that you're kind of plopped down in this room, there are a bunch of stones and potions, and you have to do your best to maximize points. And then after a certain time has elapsed, then the table is reset and you start over and do the same thing again. And that repeats for 10 rounds. And those 10 rounds together are called an episode. But then in between episodes, something very important happens, which is that the underlying chemistry changes. And the chemistry what I mean by that is the rules that govern the way that potions affect the appearance of these stones, and also the value that is attached to each of the individual stone appearances. So the underlying chemistry is actually quite rich, and I don't have time to give you the full picture, but just to give you a sense of it, each chemistry defines a particular set of stone appearances that can occur, and it defines the way that the different colored potions will transform one of these stone appearances into the other. And any chemistry can be described as a graph that's never revealed, but it articulates what the causal structure of the chemistry is. And there's a very large combinatorial space of possibilities, but there are also a small set of regularities. So just to give you one example, it's always the case that whatever the red potion does, the green potion will do the opposite. And whatever direction a potion takes appearances within the perceptual manifold, it always moves that same direction, regardless of which appearance it's acting on. And there's also a grammar that dictates which edges of this graph can be missing. So it's not a flat distribution over all the possibilities, but instead there's a very structured grammar that defines how this causal structure can be realized. And in our paper, we, of course, disclose all the details of what is a highly structured generative process that gives rise to this underlying set of chemistries. And even though there are only a few building blocks for this chemistry, for each of these chemistries, the combinatorial space gives rise to a very large set of possibilities. So it's not like the system, a learner can memorize all the possibilities. For each new chemistry, in order to succeed at the task, the agent really has to do a series of experiments that reveals what the current chemistry is. And in order to do the right set of experiments and draw the right conclusions, an agent really has to understand the probability distribution over those chemistries, which of course is dictated by this generative structure. Now, because we know the generative structure that underlies the task, we can build a Bayesian optimal agent that does, in a guaranteed way, that optimal set of experiments and that maximizes its score. So we have, in that sense, a kind of gold standard agent for evaluating the performance of learning-based models. And what we find when we take a state-of-the-art agent, in this case a VMPO agent that feeds representations of individual frames through a transformer, is that it does terribly. So this is an agent that's otherwise state-of-the-art on more traditional RL domains, but its score in Alchemy is very far below this Bayesian optimal level. And when you look at its behavior, it becomes evident very quickly that it's essentially behaving at random. And you can see that in this video. This is a bird's eye view of this VMPO agent being put in a very special handcrafted situation where all of the potions are the same color and therefore do the same thing. And you can see the agent was in a position to realize immediately that none of the potions does anything to this particular stone, but it still wanders around dunking this stone in all of the potions, when what it really should do is just give up and put that stone into the potion. And a whole host of other analyses make it clear that this otherwise highly performant deep RL agent has no idea what the underlying chemistry is. And it's not just because the system has a hard time parsing the high-dimensional visual data into object representations, because even when we give the system a symbolic representation of the current set of objects, it still operates at this essentially random level. Now, I should mention it's not doing what is done in the other systems that I've described. It doesn't put object-level representations through a relational or compositional architecture. Instead, it's doing the compositional thing, the self-attention thing, across frames of video. But even translating the visual inputs into these symbolic representations does not help with performance. If you do give the network side information, like you give it privileged information about what the current chemistry is, it can perform at ceiling, at least with these symbolic inputs. So it's not an inherent inability for this VMPO agent to do the right experiments and maximize its score, given a revealed version of the underlying chemistry. What it's having trouble with is discovering that chemistry. It's having trouble with decomposing the causal structure of this domain into these elements that compose in order to describe each new chemistry. I'll skip these other findings because I just want to point out again that even though this agent that I've just been describing uses a transformer, it's not doing self-attention at the level of objects. And so that's something we haven't tried yet, and I'm going to be very interested to see whether that approach does better on Alchemy. But at least at this point, we can say that discovering that compositional latent structure in this domain is still an open challenge. Maybe just leveraging these compositional architectures in the right way will bring to bear the right architectural bias to crack the problem. So just a couple of closing observations. So one reason that I'm optimistic that treating object level representations in the right compositional way will help us with tasks like Alchemy is that we already have evidence that dealing with object level representations can be a big win in reinforcement learning settings. So this was already evident in classic work by Carlos Duque and colleagues back in 2008, but it's also borne out by much more recent work from DeepMind on StarCraft, which, as some of you will know, was based not on pixel level inputs, but instead on discrete object level representations, which in fact were cross-attended in a transformer architecture. So I just want to temper all of the things that I've said before I close with a couple of doubts, a couple of, kind of on the other hand points. So I've made a big deal of the importance of object level representations and gone to great lengths to describe systems that decompose visual data into objects and then use the resulting object level representations for further compositional computation. But it is always possible that with enough data, systems that don't carve visual data into these pieces in such a stepwise manner will ultimately be successful. So that might be suggested, for example, by DALI, which I mentioned earlier, which does not involve explicit object representations, but which obviously does some very fancy object level compositional reasoning. Now, of course, in this case, you have the support of language, which in a way is kind of flagging the way that visual data should be decomposed into objects. And I think it's fair to say that in order to have real artificial general intelligence, we need systems that can understand object level semantics without the support of language. And my favorite example of this is this thing on the right, which everybody knows what this is, but I at least could not tell you what it was called until I looked it up. It turns out it's called a boom barrier, but I didn't know that. So it's a good example of a case where it's clear that we have rich object level semantic knowledge, but without the support of language. But on the other hand, there's also emerging evidence that architectures like transformers can discover objects and work with object level representations without really going to the lengths of something like slot attention or Monet. And there's this really cool work recently from Karen and colleagues showing that even in the self-supervised case where there are no explicit object representations, you see cross-attention picking out discrete objects. So how far one can get with that kind of implicit decomposition, I think is an interesting empirical question. I'm excited about architectures that are starting to show up that might allow the best of both worlds because, for example, in this perceiver architecture, you have pixel level representations that are cross-attending with latent representations that might learn to pull out higher level representations like object level representations. So you have a case where there's an initial set of elements, but there's also the opportunity for the system to do this learned decomposition that I was talking about before. And you can see that happening in the attentional patterns. You can see the system attending to whole objects. Here again, I think there's some really cool neuroscientific correlates because we know that the neocortex is organized in a hierarchical way that kind of echoes this structure. But without going down that particular rabbit hole, I'll close, and hopefully we have at least 1 or 2 minutes for questions. But before I open it up, I just want to pause and acknowledge all of my amazing colleagues at DeepMind who worked on the projects that I've run through. And I want to, in particular, give a shout out to Rashab Kabra, who worked on the Simone architecture, David Ding, who led the work on the Aloe model, Luis Pilato, who did the intuitive physics work, Jane Wang, who developed Alchemy, and Drew Jagel, who developed Perceiver. And thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this extremely exciting talk. It was a little bit long, but I couldn't really get myself to stop you because also I did some really important remarks. So I assume there are important questions. Maybe just jump in, or somebody's keeping track of the YouTube situation. I mean, a lot of stuff was sort of controversial, maybe particularly the neurosymbolic part. Oh, Marco has a question?
Steve was before. Steve, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, so great talk. Both neural nets and symbolic representations are underpinned by mathematics, which derives from set theory. So I found it really interesting that composition was largely ignored in previous neural net research, because it's also the case that in symbolic learning, both composition and decomposition were difficult and largely ignored until recently. So it looks like there have been developments going on in parallel. Recent breakthroughs in the use of second-order axioms that support composition to identify new subprograms and composition to support the definitions of these subprograms has been introduced in meta-interpretive learning within the last 5 years. So I wondered whether it might be valuable to investigate the mathematical commonalities of neural net and symbolic representations, like the most obvious symbolic one is mathematical logic.
Yes, I think there's a very exciting opportunity to look at relationships between those two perspectives. And of course, there are efforts going on along these lines, including efforts to look at not only set structure but also program structure to understand how processes can be played out across these kind of compositional architectures. In a way, though, we're wrestling with an issue that really was very much in view in those debates 30 years ago between what back then were these separate camps, the connectionists and the symbolic modelers, which has to do with sort of the messiness of naturalistic data. On the one hand, using symbolic methods yields to provably sound results. You end up with the right conclusions for your premises, but it makes it more difficult to deal with the inherent messiness and the kind of patterned exceptions that you see in naturalistic data. On the other hand, building systems that can cope with that messiness put you on the opposite side of the ledger with systems that can reach conclusions that are not sound. I think this is coming up now after the initial burst of enthusiasm for large-scale language models. People are realizing that they are not very reliable in terms of understanding in a rigorous way the implications of a set of statements, for example. So there is still a bridge to be gapped despite these advances we've made toward compositional representation. And I totally agree that looking to recent developments in the research domains that you flagged might be very, very useful.
Matt, I find a very refreshing talk, especially this connection with cognitive science. I think it's very important if you really want to understand more also of deep learning. In particular, I like this perspective of compositionality again. But at the end of your talk, I found a lovely picture. The picture where you see the chair and the avocado, and you say, well, they look more or less the same. Interestingly enough, they are a completely different object. And when looking at that picture, something, was crossing my mind. What about, the capability that we humans have of distinguishing the identity of a single object? I can distinguish the identity of a single chair. Of course, the chair can be posed in a completely different position in the environment. And it's really very hard to understand from the shape, what it means. So it looks like, I just like to see your perspective in terms of developmental intelligence. What do you think? Because it's something which is very interesting, at least to me, but I'm not an expert, and I'll be pleased to see your reaction on what is the meaning of the studies in developmental psychology, in your understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I have a fairly rosy view of how things are progressing in terms of our ability to develop systems using deep learning that capture that aspect of intelligence, knowing, for example, that this is the same mug even under these transformations, and that's not just a question of categorization or classification, right? It's not just a matter of being able to say mug, 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 right, for every one of those still images. It's also a matter of tracking that individual object and knowing that it's the same mug, right? That's moving across those image. There's an even deeper version of that type token distinction, which I think is a little bit out of reach still, which is tracking individual objects over longer timescales. And this is, by the way, something that we do with people, right? Like somebody walks in the room, I know it's the same person. When my wife walks in the room, I know it's the same person, right? I hate to describe my wife this way, but the same physical object that I encountered earlier in the day. And understanding that sort of identity over time is really fundamental to human cognition. For example, understanding that it's very fundamental to statistical learning. So my wife, for example, has a very unusual name. Her name is Amory. But I hear that name all the time, of course, because she's my wife. And if I didn't understand that I'm hearing the name of a particular single person over and over again, I might reach the conclusion that Amory is a very common name because I hear it all the time. So I have to understand that this is an individual and that occurrence of that name is tied to the presence of that one individual. And I have to inform my statistical learning about name frequency with that. So I think there is an aspect of this problem that's still out of reach. Just to briefly address the other part of your question, which is about developmental psychology. As you can tell from the work that I presented, I'm a big fan of developmental psychology mainly as a source of definitions for like operationalizations of particular forms of intelligence. Developmental psychologists have given us behavioral measures of things that we want in any intelligent system. And they've also given us some very clever experimental techniques that we can translate into the machine learning domain, as I illustrated. I think there are important differences of opinion, having said that, about what the intelligence of children tells us about what we need to build in to our artificial systems. So I tend to still be in that connectionist tradition of saying, let's build in as little as possible. Let's just build in some high-level architectural biases that acknowledge some very broad symmetries in real-world data, and let learning take care of the rest. But there are others who attend to developmental psychology results that have reached a different conclusion, more along the lines of, oh, well, we need to build in this kind of thing. We need like a physics engine in our systems because we know that children are born with that. So I think there are important differences of opinion that still prevail.
Thanks.
Okay, great. I think also very nice discussion. So I think we have to move on, unfortunately, but yeah, we should stay in touch somehow, and maybe through ELLIS or some other means, we can have you come back if we have a workshop on a related topic. So thanks again.